I signed up for a dark web challenge. Now I can't stop playing. It all started because of boredom. Stupid, right? But when you've got nothing to do, your mind wanders to the worst places, especially late at night. You know the feeling. You're clicking around on YouTube, Reddit, wherever, and nothing seems to grab your attention. I'd been stuck in that loop for weeks, and then, one night, I stumbled across a post on some obscure forum, the kind of place you don't usually end up unless you're deliberately trying to get lost on the internet. The post was simple. Looking for thrill seekers. Dark web challenge. $10,000 if you win. Only the brave apply. It caught my eye, mostly because of the money. 10 grand? For what? Clicking some links? It sounded too easy, but curiosity got the better of me. There was a link at the bottom, buried under layers of other posts, and without thinking, I clicked it. That's when things started to get weird. The page I landed on was stark. No flashy graphics, no ads, just a single line of text in the middle of the screen. Do you want to play? I hesitated for a second. Every rational part of my brain told me to close the tab, that this was probably a scam or worse. But the thrill of something new, something dangerous, had its hooks in me. I typed yes into the box and hit enter. Another message popped up almost instantly. Welcome to the challenge. Follow the rules and you'll be rewarded. Break them and you'll regret it. You have been assigned a partner. Wait for your instructions. The screen flickered, then went black. My heart pounded in the sudden silence of my apartment, but I convinced myself it was all just part of the game. Maybe it was one of those ARGs, an alternate reality game, where you have to solve puzzles and follow clues to win. I figured it would be a fun distraction, something to occupy my time. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. The first task is simple. Leave your apartment at exactly midnight and walk to the park down the street. Your partner will meet you there. I glanced at the clock. 11:50 p.m. I hadn't expected it to start so soon, but maybe that was part of the thrill. My hands were shaking a little, excitement mixed with a twinge of fear. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside. The night was cold, the streetlights casting long, eerie shadows on the sidewalk as I made my way toward the park. The whole way there, I kept telling myself it was just a game. Probably some prank pulled by a group of bored internet trolls. But still, the silence of the empty street felt different tonight. Heavier, like the night itself was watching me. When I reached the park, I stopped by the entrance, looking around. The place was deserted, as I expected at that hour. I stood there, feeling foolish, like I'd fallen for some elaborate joke. But before I could turn around and leave, my phone buzzed again. Go to the bench near the fountain. Your partner is waiting. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. How did they know I was here? I hadn't told anyone. Was someone watching me? My steps felt heavier as I walked toward the bench, my eyes scanning the shadows, looking for any sign of movement. When I reached the bench, I saw him. A guy, maybe around my age, sitting there, like he'd been waiting for me. His hoodie was pulled low over his face, but I could see him glance up as I approached. You here for the challenge too? He asked, his voice low, almost casual, like this was the most normal thing in the world. I nodded, feeling a little uneasy. Something about this didn't sit right with me, but I didn't know what to say. We stood there in awkward silence for a moment before my phone buzzed again. The second task is simple. You and your partner must switch phones for the next hour. No questions, no cheating. I stared at the screen, my pulse quickening. Switch phones? That felt a little too personal, too invasive. But the game was clear. Follow the rules or face the consequences. I hesitated for a second before holding out my phone to him. He did the same, and we swapped devices. His phone felt cold and heavy in my hand, like I was holding something dangerous. For the next hour, we sat in silence on that bench, neither of us saying a word. I wanted to check his phone, to see what kind of messages he was getting, but I didn't dare. The game had already started, and I wasn't about to break the rules this early on. Finally, my phone buzzed again in his hand. He handed it back to me without a word, and I glanced at the screen. Good. Task complete. Go home. Your next task will come soon. I didn't wait around to see what he would do. I nodded at him, muttering something about seeing him around, and walked back to my apartment as quickly as I could. My mind was racing, adrenaline pumping through my veins. What the hell was this game? Who was behind it? And why did I feel like I had just crossed a line I couldn't come back from? When I got home, I checked my phone again, half expecting another message, but there was nothing, just silence. That was the first night. I didn't sleep much after that. Something about the whole thing gnawed at me, like a splinter in my mind. I kept thinking about the guy at the park, about how calm he had been, about the way we had just sat there, waiting for instructions like obedient puppets. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been a one-time thing. A strange experience, sure, but nothing to worry about. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. The game wasn't over. In fact, it had only just begun. The next few days were quiet. Too quiet. I kept expecting another message, another task, but my phone stayed silent. At first, I was relieved. I told myself maybe it was over, that the game was just a one-time thing. But the deeper I thought about it, the more that uneasy feeling crept back in. I couldn't stop thinking about that guy at the park. His calm, detached attitude, the way he barely reacted to anything. It was like he'd done this before, like it was nothing new to him. It didn't make sense. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't seen the last of him, or this so-called challenge. It wasn't until the following Friday that things started to go downhill. It was late again, just like the first time. I was sitting in front of my laptop, scrolling mindlessly through Reddit, when my phone buzzed. I stared at it for a second, heart skipping a beat. That same unknown number had lit up my screen. I hesitated before picking it up. The message was short. Ready for your next task? A pit formed in my stomach. I didn't know what to expect, but I knew one thing. This wasn't going to be something simple. The game was escalating. I could feel it. Another message came through, immediately after the first. Go to the abandoned house on Ridgeway Road. Bring your partner. You have 1 hour. My pulse quickened. Ridgeway Road was just a few blocks away, but I knew the house they were talking about. Everyone in the neighborhood knew it. It had been abandoned for years, boarded up and rotting, the kind of place kids dared each other to go near, but never actually did. It had a reputation. Rumors of strange noises, shadows in the windows at night. The usual creepy urban legend stuff. But now they were telling me to go there, in the middle of the night, and to bring my partner. The thought of that guy from the park flashed through my mind, and I realized something chilling. I had no way of contacting him. I didn't know his name, didn't have his number, and yet I knew they'd expect him to be there. Somehow, I knew he would be. Before I could even think about what to do next, another text buzzed in. We'll be watching. The weight of those words hit me hard. This wasn't just a game anymore. Whoever was behind this, they weren't messing around, and they weren't giving me a choice. I grabbed my jacket and headed out, my mind racing. As I walked down the street toward Ridgeway Road, The night felt different, heavier, darker, like the shadows were deeper than usual. It was as if the world itself was pressing in on me, reminding me I wasn't in control anymore. When I reached the house, it loomed in the darkness like something out of a nightmare. The windows were boarded up, the roof sagging in places, vines crawling up the walls. I hesitated at the gate, my breath fogging in the cold night air. And then, just like I expected, I saw him. The guy from the park. He was standing there, just inside the gate, as if he'd been waiting for me all along. His hoodie was pulled low again, casting shadows over his face, but there was no mistaking him. He gave me a nod, his expression unreadable. "You got the message too?" I said, more of a statement than a question. "Yeah," he replied, his voice calm, almost bored. "Figured you'd show up." There was something in the way he said it, like he knew more than I did, like he knew exactly what was about to happen. That made my skin crawl, but I didn't have time to think about it. The house stood before us, silent and menacing. "You ready?" he asked, already moving toward the door. I wasn't, not even close, but I followed him anyway, my legs feeling like they weighed a ton. There was something about this whole thing that was pulling me in, some invisible force driving me forward, even though every instinct screamed at me to turn around and run. We reached the door, and before I could say anything, he pushed it open. The hinges groaned, echoing through the stillness of the night. Inside, it was pitch black, the air thick with the smell of dust and decay. I hesitated on the threshold, peering into the darkness. "Let's get this over with," he muttered, stepping inside without waiting for me. I swallowed hard and followed. The inside of the house was worse than I'd imagined. The floorboards creaked underfoot, and the walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, like the place had been rotting from the inside out for decades. It was freezing, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and made you want to turn back. But we kept moving. I glanced around, half expecting something to jump out at us, but the house was eerily quiet. No wind, no distant noises, just the soft creak of the floor beneath our feet. My phone buzzed again. I pulled it out, already dreading what the next message would be. "Go to the basement?" I stopped in my tracks, staring at the message. Basement? Of course, there was a basement. There's always a basement in these kinds of places. The guy noticed I'd stopped and glanced back at me, his face barely visible in the dim light. "You good?" "Yeah," I lied, forcing myself to move forward. "Just got another message. Basement." He didn't react, just nodded and kept walking. We found the door to the basement in the back of the house, half hidden behind a crumbling old cabinet. It was small, barely noticeable, like it hadn't been opened in years. The handle was rusty, and it took both of us to wrench it open. A narrow staircase descended into the darkness below, the air even colder than the rest of the house. I could smell something damp, something earthy, like the ground had seeped into the walls down there. Neither of us spoke as we made our way down the steps, the sound of our footsteps echoing in the narrow space. Every step felt heavier, like we were descending into something we couldn't escape from. When we reached the bottom, the small flashlight I'd brought barely lit the room, but I could see enough. The basement was empty. No furniture, no signs of anyone living down here. Just 4 bare walls and a dirt floor. That's when my phone buzzed again. Dig. My blood ran cold. Dig? There was nothing down here. No tools, no shovels, just bare earth beneath our feet. The guy glanced at me, his calm demeanor finally showing a crack. "What does it say?" I showed him the screen. He stared at it for a moment, then without a word, He crouched down and started digging with his hands. I hesitated, watching him for a second before crouching down next to him. The dirt was cold, clumping under my nails as we both dug into the floor of the basement, the silence around us growing heavier with every passing second. We kept digging, my breath growing more ragged, more frantic, when suddenly my hand hit something hard. I froze. The guy looked at me, then brushed more dirt away, revealing what lay beneath. It was a box. The box was small, wooden, and covered in dirt, like it had been buried there for years. My fingers trembled as I brushed more of the earth away, revealing its rough surface. The guy next to me just stared, his eyes fixed on it like he was expecting this all along. "What do you think's in it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know why I was whispering. Maybe because the basement felt like a place where loud noises shouldn't exist, where we shouldn't exist. He shrugged, but there was a tension in his face now that hadn't been there before. He wasn't as calm anymore. "Only one way to find out." I swallowed hard and reached for the box. My hands were filthy, caked with dirt, but I didn't care. I just wanted to open it, to see what the hell was inside. I was about to pry it open when my phone buzzed again. I almost didn't want to check it, but I did. "Don't open it yet. Wait." My breath caught in my throat. They were watching us. Of course they were. But now it felt more invasive, more personal, like they were sitting just out of sight, pulling the strings. "What does it say?" he asked, his voice sounding more strained than before. "They want us to wait," I muttered, showing him the message. He frowned but nodded. We both stood there, staring at the box like it held some dark secret neither of us was ready to face. The cold air in the basement felt heavier now, pressing down on us, as if the very walls were watching too. After a few minutes of silence, my phone buzzed again. My heart skipped a beat as I unlocked the screen. "Open it now," slowly. I took a deep breath and looked at him. He just nodded, his face tense. Whatever was in that box, we were about to find out. With shaking hands, I pried the lid open. The hinges creaked, the sound echoing in the small basement, and for a moment, I expected something terrible to leap out at us. But when the box finally opened, all I saw was darkness. I tilted it toward the dim light of the flashlight, my fingers brushing the edge of the interior, and felt something soft, like fabric. I pulled it out slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. It was a small folded cloth, simple, unassuming. But there was something off about it, something that sent a chill down my spine. I handed it to him, and he unfolded it carefully, his brow furrowed as he examined it. Inside the cloth was a key, a small, rusted key, like the kind you'd find for an old padlock. I stared at it, confusion swirling in my mind. "What the hell is this for?" I asked, feeling more unsettled by the second. He didn't answer. He was staring at the key, his eyes dark with something I couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe, or recognition. Before I could ask him what was going on, my phone buzzed again. "Take the key, go upstairs. There's a locked door. You'll know which one." I stood up, my legs shaking slightly. The guy pocketed the key without a word, and we both headed back up the stairs, the creaking floorboards beneath us adding to the growing sense of dread. The air in the house felt colder, more oppressive, like we were intruding on something we weren't supposed to. When we reached the top of the stairs, I glanced around, searching for this so-called locked door. The hallway stretched out in front of us, dark and decaying, with several doors lining the walls. None of them looked any different from the others. But then, at the far end, I saw it. A door, just like the others. But there was something about it that drew my attention. The wood looked newer, less worn than the rest of the house, and the way it stood slightly ajar felt deliberate, like it was waiting for us. We exchanged a glance. Neither of us wanted to say what we were thinking, that this was a mistake, that we should turn around and leave, but we both knew we wouldn't. The game had us now. We couldn't just walk away. He stepped forward, and I followed close behind, my heart pounding in my chest. When we reached the door, he pulled out the key, his hand shaking just slightly. He slid it into the lock and turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a dark room beyond. I held up the flashlight, my hand trembling as I illuminated the space. It was small, cramped, with old furniture covered in dust. A wooden table stood in the middle of the room, and on it, something glinted in the light. I stepped closer, trying to get a better look. It was another box, but this one was different. Larger, more ornate, with strange carvings etched into the wood. My pulse quickened. I didn't want to open it. Every part of me was screaming to get out of there, to leave this place and never look back. But we both knew that wasn't an option. The guy stepped forward, his face set in a grim expression, and reached for the box. Just as his fingers brushed the lid, my phone buzzed again. I didn't even want to look at it, but I did. Only one of you opens it. I stared at the message, my heart racing. I felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, and one wrong move would send me plummeting into something I couldn't come back from. I showed him the message. He read it, his face tightening. What the hell does that mean? I shook my head. I don't know. We both stood there, the silence stretching out between us. I didn't know what to do. I didn't even know if I wanted to find out what was inside that box. Then, without another word, he reached down and opened it. The lid creaked as it lifted, and I leaned forward, trying to see what was inside. The box was empty. For a moment, we both just stared at it, disbelief washing over us. After everything, there was nothing, just an empty wooden box. I felt a strange mix of relief and disappointment. But then I noticed something, a small slip of paper, tucked into the corner of the box, barely visible in the dim light. I reached in and grabbed it, my hands trembling. There were only 3 words written on it. He chose wrong. Before I could even process what that meant, the door behind us slammed shut. The door slammed shut with such force that it sent a shockwave through my entire body. The sound echoed in the small room, and for a moment, I couldn't move. My mind went blank with terror. The guy next to me whipped around, his eyes wide, his calm demeanor from earlier shattered. "Did you see that?" he whispered, his voice tight with fear. I didn't respond. I couldn't. I was too busy staring at the slip of paper in my hand, the 3 words burning into my mind. He chose wrong. I didn't know what it meant, but every instinct in my body told me it wasn't good. My heart raced as I shoved the note into my pocket, and I tried to calm my breathing, my thoughts racing. I felt trapped, like the walls of the room were closing in around me. Something had changed. The game wasn't just a game anymore. It felt darker, real. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice shaking now. He grabbed the doorknob and twisted, pulling at the door. It didn't budge. Shit. I moved toward the door, panic rising. I pulled at the handle too, but it was locked, the cold metal unyielding in my hand. I could feel my pulse thudding in my ears, the pressure in the room almost unbearable. That's when my phone buzzed again. I hesitated, not wanting to look, but I didn't have a choice. I unlocked the screen with shaking hands. "It's too late to leave now. You both knew the risks." My stomach dropped. The risks? What risks? No one had explained anything to us, just vague instructions, simple tasks. But now, it felt like the game had turned on us. The shadows in the room seemed darker, the air thicker. "Let me see," he demanded, reaching for my phone. I handed it to him, and he stared at the message for a long moment, his face pale. He handed it back without a word. I swallowed hard. There has to be another way out. We searched the room, our movements frantic. There were no windows, no other doors, just the dusty furniture and that damned empty box sitting on the table. The room felt like a tomb, and we were trapped inside. My phone buzzed again. This time, I didn't hesitate. I read the message aloud. "You were warned. Only one of you can leave." I felt the blood drain from my face. My hands trembled. My legs felt weak. The room felt smaller, like it was closing in, suffocating me with the weight of the realization. This wasn't just a game. It had never been just a game. "We have to figure this out," I muttered, pacing the room, my mind racing. "There has to be a way out for both of us." He didn't respond. When I looked at him, I saw a shift in his eyes, something darker. He wasn't calm anymore, and his fear had twisted into something else, something more dangerous. He looked at me like I was part of the problem now, like I was the obstacle standing between him and freedom. The silence in the room was unbearable. I tried to come up with a plan, but my thoughts were scattered, my mind locked in a loop of panic. My phone buzzed again, and I was almost too afraid to check it, but I did. "Only one of you leaves, the other stays behind. Choose." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Choose? Choose what? It was some kind of twisted ultimatum, and I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to think about what they were asking us to do. He stepped toward me, his movements slow, deliberate. "I'm not staying here," he said, his voice low. His calm was gone, replaced by something colder. "I'm not dying in this place." I backed away, instinctively, my mind scrambling for a way out. "Neither of us is dying," I said, trying to sound confident. "We just have to figure out how to..." He cut me off, taking another step forward. His eyes were locked on me now, and I could see the fear in them, but it wasn't the kind of fear that paralyzes you. It was the kind of fear that makes you dangerous. I didn't want to think about what he was planning. "We have to make a choice," he said, his voice steady, like he was trying to convince himself. "It's either you or me." I shook my head, panic rising. "No, that's not how this works. We can figure this out. There's a way out for both of us. There has to be." But even as I said the words, I didn't believe them. I could feel the weight of the situation crushing down on me, the darkness in the room pressing in. There was no way out, not for both of us. The tension in the room was unbearable. He took another step forward, and I could see his hands trembling. He wasn't calm anymore. He was desperate. Desperate people do dangerous things. "I'm not staying here," he repeated, his voice growing more frantic. "I'm not." My phone buzzed again, and I barely had time to react before I read the message. "Make the choice now, or we'll make it for you." The room was closing in, the air growing colder. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. He was too close now, his eyes wild, his breath shallow. "We don't have to do this," I said, my voice shaking. "We can find a way." He lunged at me. I stumbled back, crashing into the table, the empty box rattling as I tried to regain my balance. He grabbed for me again, and I shoved him away, my mind racing. I didn't want to fight him. I didn't want to hurt him, but I didn't have a choice. He came at me again, his face twisted with fear and desperation. I grabbed the closest thing I could find, a broken piece of wood from the crumbling furniture, and swung it at him. It wasn't hard, just enough to knock him back. He stumbled, clutching his side, and for a moment, the room went still. I stared at him, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my hands shaking. He looked up at me, his eyes wide, and I realized what I'd done, what this game had forced me to do. He collapsed onto the floor, breathing heavily, and I didn't move. I couldn't. The weight of everything hit me all at once, and I felt like I was drowning in it. My phone buzzed one last time. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to know what it said, but I did. Congratulations, you've made your choice. The door behind me creaked open. The door creaked open, and the cold air from the hallway rushed in, cutting through the thick tension that had swallowed the room. I stood there frozen, staring at the open doorway like it was some kind of twisted portal, one that led me out of this nightmare. But behind me, the guy I'd knocked down was still on the floor, breathing heavily, his hand clutching his side. I couldn't believe it. After everything that had happened, they were just going to let me walk out. The whole thing felt like a trap, like something even worse was waiting for me on the other side. But that wasn't the worst part. I'd won. I didn't know how to feel about that. The game, if you could even call it that, had forced me to make a choice I never wanted to make. One of us had to stay behind, and that meant one of us had to leave. I glanced down at the guy on the floor. His face was pale, his eyes wide and full of something that was no longer fear. It was resignation. He knew what had just happened. He knew the rules, just like I did. "I'm sorry," I whispered, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew they sounded hollow. What was I apologizing for? For winning? For making it out when he didn't? He didn't respond. He just stared up at me, his breathing shallow, as if he knew this was it for him. The game had chosen, and I wasn't the one staying behind. My phone buzzed again. This time, I didn't want to look, but my hand moved on its own, fingers trembling as I unlocked the screen. "You can leave now. The game's over for you." I let out a shaky breath, staring at the message. Over. Just like that. I didn't believe it. It didn't feel over. It felt like the end of one thing and the beginning of something much worse. But they were giving me a way out. All I had to do was walk through that door. I hesitated, looking back at him one last time. He hadn't moved. He was just watching me with those hollow eyes, as if he'd already accepted his fate. I knew I should have felt relief. Relief that it wasn't me lying on that floor, waiting for whatever came next, but all I felt was guilt. Heavy, suffocating guilt that wrapped itself around me like chains. "Come with me," I said, barely believing the words myself. I didn't know what I was saying. I knew the rules. He knew the rules. But the thought of leaving him behind, alone in this cursed place, gnawed at me. He shook his head, a bitter smile tugging at his lips. "You know, it doesn't work like that," he whispered. The silence in the room grew heavier, thicker, like the house itself was holding its breath. I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me, urging me to leave, to walk out of that door and never look back. But leaving wasn't easy. Not when you know what you're leaving behind. "I'm sorry," I said again, this time louder, more desperate. But it was too late. I couldn't change the rules, and I couldn't save him. I turned toward the door, my heart pounding in my chest. My body felt heavy, every step like I was wading through thick mud. The hallway outside was dark, just as cold and eerie as when we'd first arrived, but now it felt different, like it was pulling me forward, guiding me to the exit, to freedom. I stepped into the hallway, glancing back one last time. He hadn't moved. His face was lost in shadow now, barely visible in the dim light from the open door. And then the door slowly swung shut behind me, the creak of the hinges sending a shiver down my spine. I stood there, staring at the closed door, knowing I'd never see him again, that whatever happened next, he would face it alone. I made my way down the hall, my mind numb, my footsteps echoing through the house. The walls seemed to close in around me, the air growing colder with every step. The house felt alive now, like it had been watching us the whole time, waiting for the game to end. When I reached the front door, it was already open, the night air outside a stark contrast to the suffocating atmosphere inside. I stepped out onto the porch, the cold wind biting at my skin, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I breathed. But it didn't feel like freedom. I glanced around the empty street, the silence of the neighborhood, unnerving in its normalcy. It was like nothing had happened, like the world outside hadn't even noticed what I'd been through. And maybe it hadn't. I checked my phone one last time, half expecting another message, another twisted instruction. But there was nothing, just the empty silence of the night. I walked down the street, the weight of what I'd done pressing down on me with every step. The house loomed behind me, dark and still, as if it had swallowed everything inside and closed the door on it forever. When I reached my apartment, I sat on the couch, staring at the blank screen of my phone. The guilt still weighed heavy in my chest. I'd made it out. I'd won. But it didn't feel like winning. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, his hollow eyes staring up at me, his resigned smile. The weight of the choice I'd made pressed down on me, suffocating me, even as I lay in my own bed, far from that house. The next morning, I woke up to a notification. I didn't want to check it. I didn't want to see what it said. But I did. Congratulations, you're free. I stared at the message, my heart pounding in my chest. Free? That's what they called this? But deep down, I knew the truth. I'd never really be free, because the game never really ends. I found a website on the dark web that claims to show you a future. The ending is horrifying. It all started one of those nights when sleep felt impossible. You know the kind, where you stare at the ceiling for hours, your mind racing over everything and nothing at the same time. That night, instead of lying there in frustration, I did what I always do. I grabbed my phone, turned on my laptop, and let the endless scroll of the internet suck me in. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just hopping from link to link, reading random threads on Reddit, watching YouTube videos that had nothing to do with each other. But at some point, I ended up on a post about the dark web. Normally, I would have scrolled past it, but this one caught my eye. The title was simple. Have you ever visited the future predicting website? I rolled my eyes at first. Future predicting websites? That sounded like something straight out of a bad horror movie. But I kept reading out of boredom. The post didn't have many details, just vague mentions of a site on the dark web where you could enter your information and it would predict your future with eerie accuracy. The comments were divided. Some people laughed it off, calling it a scam, while others claimed the site had predicted their careers, their relationships, even the exact date of a loved one's death. One comment stood out, though. It simply said, "Don't go to the end. Trust me." Curiosity tugged at me. I've never been one to buy into that kind of stuff, but part of me thought, why not? I was already deep into my late-night rabbit hole, so I figured, what's the harm in checking it out? I wasn't expecting much, maybe some dumb questionnaire or a cheap scare. I opened up Tor, the browser that lets you access the dark web, and found the link in the original post. The site didn't have a name, just a string of random letters and numbers, but it loaded faster than I expected. The homepage was plain, just black, with white text in the center. Enter your name to begin. It looked normal. No creepy images, no weird vibes. It was almost disappointing, actually. I hesitated for a second, then typed my name into the box. Jake. The screen flashed, and a new message appeared. Do you want to see your future? There were two options. Yes or no. Of course, I clicked. Yes. That's when the website changed. The screen went black for a moment, then a strange symbol, a circle with an eye in the center, appeared at the top of the page. Below it, text started appearing, but it wasn't generic or vague like I'd expected. It was detailed. It knew things about me. The first few lines were about things anyone could guess, like my age and where I lived. But then, it started getting personal, really personal. It listed the exact date and time I'd graduated college, the name of my first pet, and even the fact that I had spilled coffee on my laptop that very morning. It was weird. No, scratch that. It was unsettling. I hadn't told anyone about that coffee spill. I hadn't posted about it. Hell, I hadn't even left the house after it happened. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, but I convinced myself it was probably some data mining trick. Maybe the site was pulling information from public records or something. But as I scrolled down, it got weirder. The next part of the site was blank except for a single prompt. Would you like to see what happens next in your life? My heart was racing now. I should have clicked off, should have shut the laptop and gone to bed, but I didn't. I was too far in. I clicked yes. The screen flickered for a second before a timeline appeared. At the top, there was a small box showing my current age, 27. Below that, the timeline extended into the future. Every few years, it marked major life events, promotions, relationships, moves to new cities. It all seemed pretty standard at first, but then I noticed something odd. The timeline ended at 32. That couldn't be right. I scrolled down, trying to figure out if the site had glitched or if I'd missed something, but no. It just stopped. There was nothing beyond my 32nd birthday. I felt a knot form in my stomach. I stared at the screen, half expecting it to change, but it didn't. The last event listed was something vague. A significant change occurs in your life at 32. That's it. Nothing more. I sat there, staring at the screen for what felt like forever. 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind. What did that mean? Was it trying to tell me I wouldn't make it past 32? Or was it some kind of sick joke? Before I could process it, the screen shifted again. Another message appeared at the bottom of the page. Would you like to know the truth? Click here to see the ending. For the first time, I hesitated. This wasn't just some cheap thrill anymore. I had a bad feeling, a really bad feeling. The words from that Reddit comment echoed in my head. Don't go to the end. Trust me. I should have listened. I should have clicked out and left it all behind. But I didn't. I clicked the link. The moment I clicked, the screen went black again. This time, it stayed that way for longer. Just as I was about to refresh the page, text appeared. You will see your ending in 3 minutes. A countdown started at the top of the screen. The seconds ticked by slowly, each one adding to the knot of fear twisting in my stomach. I wanted to stop, to close the laptop, but something kept me glued to the screen. As the countdown reached 0, the screen flickered, and then a video began to play. It wasn't pre-recorded. This was live. I could tell by the way the camera wobbled slightly, like someone was holding it, filming in real time. The video showed my apartment, my living room, to be exact, The same living room I was sitting in. My blood ran cold as the camera slowly panned across the room, over the couch, the coffee table, the empty chair by the window. Then the camera moved toward me. Except it wasn't me. Sitting in the chair where I was supposed to be was a man. He looked exactly like me. Same clothes, same hair, same everything. He sat there staring straight ahead, unblinking, as if he was waiting for something. I leaned closer to the screen, my heart racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. How could this be live? How could someone have filmed my apartment without me knowing? Suddenly, the camera zoomed in on the man's face, on my face. His expression didn't change, but his eyes, they shifted slightly, just enough to look directly at the camera, directly at me. He smiled. The screen cut to black. I slammed the laptop shut and pushed it away, my heart hammering in my chest. What the hell had I just seen? That wasn't possible. None of it was possible. But I had seen it. I had seen me, or someone who looked exactly like me, staring back through the screen. For a long time, I just sat there in the darkness, trying to calm down, trying to convince myself it was all a trick. Some elaborate hoax or a deep fake. That had to be it. There was no way it was real. But no matter how hard I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. The fact that the video had shown my apartment, my room, in real time, it was too specific, too personal. And that smile, that smug, knowing smile, it was like the man in the video, whoever he was, knew something I didn't, like he was waiting for me to figure it out. I tried to shake it off, but sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, my face, staring back at me. I kept checking the door, the windows, convinced that someone was watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. The next day, things only got worse. I woke up late, groggy from the lack of sleep, and when I checked my phone, I had dozens of missed calls. They were from my family, friends, even my boss. The messages were all the same. Are you okay? Call us back. I quickly dialed my mom's number, and she picked up almost immediately. Her voice was panicked. Jake, where have you been? You just disappeared yesterday. No one's heard from you? Disappeared? I tried to explain that I'd been home the whole time, that I hadn't gone anywhere, but she didn't believe me. According to her, I hadn't shown up for work, hadn't answered any calls or texts, and when she tried to visit me, my mom's words hit me like a punch to the gut. Disappeared? How could I have disappeared when I'd been in my apartment the whole time? I tried to explain it to her, but she wasn't having it. Jake, I went to your apartment. I knocked. I even tried calling you from outside. There was no answer. I felt my stomach churn. She had been outside my apartment, and I hadn't heard a thing? It didn't make sense. It felt like my world was starting to blur around the edges. I told her I was fine, that I'd just been busy. But as soon as I hung up, I knew I was lying to both of us. Nothing was fine. I sat on my couch, staring at the dark screen of my laptop, too scared to open it again. The sight, that video of me, something wasn't right. None of this was right. But deep down, I had a horrible feeling that it wasn't over. I couldn't shake that image of the man who looked exactly like me, sitting in my apartment, smiling like he knew something I didn't. I needed to figure this out. I needed answers. Reluctantly, I opened my laptop again. The screen lit up, and there it was. The same website, still open, still waiting. The black background, the strange eye symbol at the top, and the same question blinking at the bottom of the page. Do you want to see more? Everything in me screamed to close the laptop, to walk away, to pretend none of this had ever happened. But I couldn't. I needed to know. I clicked. The screen went black again, just like before, and a new video started to play. This time, there was no countdown, no warning. The camera was shaking, as if someone was running, and the image was grainy, hard to make out at first. Then I saw it, my apartment. The front door was wide open, swinging slightly in the wind. The camera moved inside, panning across the living room, the same room I was sitting in now. My blood ran cold as I realized what was happening. The video wasn't showing a memory. It wasn't showing some distant future. It was showing right now. I looked around my living room, heart pounding, expecting to see the camera crew or whoever was filming me, but the room was empty. Yet, on the screen, the camera continued to move through my apartment, coming closer to where I was sitting. My breath caught in my throat. In the video, the camera paused right behind the couch, right behind me. I whipped around, but there was nothing there, just the empty space where I had left it moments ago. I turned back to the screen, and that's when I saw it. Mister sitting on the couch, exactly where I was, staring at the laptop, just like I was. But the person on the screen wasn't me, not really. It looked like me, sure. Same clothes, same hair, same everything. But there was something off about him. His eyes, they were cold, empty, like he wasn't there. And then he slowly turned his head, breaking the illusion that he was just a reflection of me. He wasn't looking at the laptop anymore. He was looking at the camera. He was looking at me. A slow, eerie smile spread across his face. I backed away from the screen, my hands shaking. This wasn't possible. This couldn't be happening. I was losing my mind. I had to be. But there he was, on the screen, smiling like he knew something I didn't. He stood up, still staring at me, and began walking toward the door. I stood up, panic rising in my chest. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I ran to my front door and threw it open, expecting to see, I don't even know, the other me. But when I looked out into the hallway, it was empty. I turned back to the screen. The other me was gone. The video had stopped, replaced by a single line of text. It's time to meet your replacement. I stood frozen, staring at the words, my mind racing. Replacement? What did that mean? I tried to close the laptop, but before I could, the screen flickered once more. A final video began to play. This one was different. It wasn't showing my apartment. It was showing me. The real me. I was standing in the hallway looking confused, looking scared. And then, slowly, the camera panned to the right. A figure stepped into the frame. It was him, the other me. But this time, he wasn't smiling. He was staring at me with cold, lifeless eyes, standing just a few feet away from where I was standing in real life. I looked to my right, expecting to see him standing there, but there was nothing, just empty air. The video kept playing, showing the other me walking toward the real me, closing the distance between us. My heart raced, every instinct in my body screaming at me to run, but I was rooted in place, staring at the screen like a deer caught in headlights. The other me raised his hand and placed it on my shoulder in the video. I felt the cold touch in real life. I gasped, spinning around, but there was still no one there. Then, on the screen, the other me leaned in close, whispering something in my ear. "You're done now." The video cut to black. I slammed the laptop shut, backing away from it like it was some kind of cursed object. My mind was spinning, my body trembling. I didn't know what had just happened, but I knew one thing. I wasn't safe anymore. Whoever, or whatever, had shown me that video had taken something from me, and they weren't done. The room felt darker now, the shadows deeper. I couldn't stay here. I grabbed my keys and bolted for the door, but before I could leave, my phone buzzed in my pocket. A text message. I didn't want to look. I knew it was going to be from them, but I couldn't help myself. My hand shook as I pulled out my phone and unlocked it. The message was short, chilling in its simplicity. There's nowhere left to run, Jake. You've already been replaced. I joined a support group on the dark web. The members keep showing up in my life. It started like most things do nowadays. Late at night, alone in my apartment, browsing the internet when I couldn't sleep. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just something to fill the void until I could drift off. But when you get that late and you're that bored, you start to click on the weird stuff, the links you wouldn't normally even glance at. That's how I ended up on the dark web. It's not as mysterious as people make it out to be. It's just like a dirtier, sketchier version of the regular internet. You can find anything there, and I mean anything. But I wasn't looking for anything illegal. I wasn't trying to buy drugs or stolen credit cards. I was just curious. I ended up on some random forum. The name escapes me now, but it had one of those vague titles like Beyond the Wall or something equally pretentious. It was filled with all kinds of weird posts. People ranting about conspiracies, hackers boasting about their latest feats, people discussing underground communities you wouldn't find anywhere else. That's when I stumbled upon a thread titled Support Group for the Unseen. The post was simple, a few lines describing a group for people who felt invisible, ignored by society, disconnected from the world. The wording was strange, like whoever wrote it had experienced some kind of deep, personal isolation that I couldn't quite wrap my head around, but something about it resonated with me. I don't know if it was just late-night boredom or the feeling that I could relate to that sense of being overlooked, but I clicked on the link. I wish I hadn't. The link took me to a bare-bones website. There wasn't much, just a black background with a single message in white text. Welcome to the unseen. Here, we notice you. Below that was a button to join the group. I hesitated for a second. It felt off, like I was crossing a line I didn't fully understand. But something about the way they phrased it, we notice you, that got to me. I clicked the button. Immediately, I was taken to a chat room. It was simple, just a black screen with usernames on the left and messages scrolling on the right. Most of the usernames were weird combinations of letters and numbers, nothing that gave any hint to who the people were. But the messages, they were personal, too personal. People were sharing stories of how they felt invisible in their lives. There were posts about people who never seemed to be remembered by others, who walked through life unnoticed, like they didn't even exist. One person talked about how they were constantly overlooked at work, their presence ignored at meetings, their contributions dismissed like they hadn't even spoken. Another talked about feeling like they were literally invisible, like they could walk into a room and no one would notice them until they spoke up. And even then, people would glance at them with this strange confusion, like they couldn't quite figure out where they'd come from. It was eerie, but it also felt familiar. I'd had moments like that, times when I felt like no one saw me, like I was just blending into the background of my own life. It wasn't constant, but it happened enough that I could relate. After lurking for a while, I decided to post. Nothing big, just something like, I felt this way too sometimes. Almost immediately, someone replied, "We know." The response sent a shiver down my spine. I brushed it off, thinking it was just a coincidence, but then more people started responding. Messages flooded in, all welcoming me to the group. It felt strangely comforting at first, like I'd found a corner of the internet where people understood what I was going through. But as the night wore on, the messages became unsettling. Someone with the username Watcher23 sent me a private message. "We notice you now. You're part of us." I didn't respond. Something about the phrasing made me uneasy, but the message sat there, lingering in the back of my mind. By the time I logged off, it was almost 3 a.m., and I was more exhausted than ever. I shut my laptop, crawled into bed, and tried to forget about the whole thing. It was just another weird corner of the internet, I told myself. No big deal. But the next day, I started noticing things. It began with small stuff. I'd go to the coffee shop down the street and catch the barista staring at me for a second too long, like she recognized me from somewhere but couldn't quite place it. When I walked to work, I'd notice people glancing my way, then looking confused, like they were trying to figure out why they noticed me at all. It wasn't constant, but it was enough to make me feel off, uncomfortable. And then, on my way home from work, I saw someone who stopped me cold. It was a man standing at the corner of my street, leaning against a lamppost. At first, I didn't think anything of it. Just some random guy waiting for someone. But then I noticed his jacket. It was too familiar. Dark green, tattered around the edges, like it had seen better days. I knew that jacket. I'd seen it before. It was the profile picture of Watcher23. He didn't say anything. He didn't even look directly at me. But he didn't need to. I knew he was there because of the group, because I joined, because now I was part of it. I kept walking, my heart pounding in my chest, trying not to make eye contact, trying to convince myself it was just a coincidence. But deep down, I knew better. Something had shifted, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. I didn't log back into the group that night, but that didn't stop them from finding me. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that guy. The one with the green jacket, standing there at the corner like he was waiting for something. Or worse, someone. I told myself it was just a coincidence. I'd spent too much time on that creepy dark website, read too many weird messages, and now my brain was playing tricks on me. People wait on street corners all the time. It didn't mean anything. I tried to push it out of my mind, but it kept creeping back in, that uneasy feeling that something was off. The next day I tried to get back to my routine. I went to work, had my usual coffee, scrolled through my emails like normal. But the whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't like I could see anyone staring at me. No one was outright following me. But I felt it. The eyes, the attention. That weird sense that someone was constantly just there. It wasn't until lunch that things got really strange. I usually ate at this little sandwich place near my office. I'd been going there for years, so I knew the staff pretty well, at least by face. But that day, when I walked in, the girl behind the counter, someone I'd talked to dozens of times, acted like she didn't know me at all. She gave me this blank look, like she was struggling to place where she'd seen me before. "You new around here?" she asked, squinting at me like I was some stranger. I laughed, thinking she was joking, but when I looked into her eyes, there was no recognition, no flicker of familiarity. She didn't remember me at all. "No, I'm in here all the time," I said, trying to keep things light. "I usually get the turkey on rye." She stared at me for a second longer, then shrugged, like I'd just told her the most irrelevant thing in the world. "Right, sorry, must have forgotten." It was a small interaction, something that normally wouldn't bother me, but in that moment, it was like I was fading out of her memory, like I didn't belong in her world anymore. As I sat down to eat, I started noticing it more. People who I passed every day, on the way to work, at the coffee shop, seemed to look through me. Not at me, but through me, like I wasn't there at all. Like I was some strange glitch in their day, something they couldn't quite make sense of. I kept telling myself it was just in my head. I was paranoid, right? I'd been browsing the dark web too much, spent too much time on that creepy support group. But the more I tried to shake it off, the stronger it got. The world around me started feeling like it was subtly shifting, like I was slipping out of people's awareness. It wasn't until I got home that I realized just how real it was. I stepped into my apartment, dropped my keys on the counter, and noticed something strange. My laptop was open, which was weird because I was sure I'd closed it before I left that morning. The screen was on, displaying the dark web chat room, the one for the support group. I hadn't logged in. I hadn't even opened my laptop that day. My heart raced as I walked over to the desk. The chat was active. Messages were flooding in, but they weren't like the ones I'd seen before. They weren't people talking about feeling invisible or being ignored by society. They were talking about me. He's almost ready. He's starting to notice it. We'll reach him soon. I stared at the screen, my blood running cold. I hadn't posted anything since my first message. How were they talking about me? How did they know what I was thinking, what I was experiencing? I scrolled through the messages, my hands shaking, until I found one from Watcher 23. It's time. He's part of us now. That's when the doorbell rang. I froze, staring at the door. No one ever came by my apartment unannounced, especially not at this hour. The ringing stopped after a moment, but I didn't move. I was glued to the spot, listening, waiting for something to happen. Then, a knock. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. My mind raced. Was it the guy from the corner? Was it someone from the group? How did they know where I lived? I didn't open the door. I couldn't. My entire body was locked in place with fear. But the knocking didn't stop. It was patient, rhythmic, like whoever was out there knew I was inside, knew I was listening. Finally, after what felt like hours, the knocking stopped. I waited, listening for footsteps, the sound of someone walking away. But there was nothing, just silence. My phone buzzed on the desk. I almost didn't look, but the tension in the air was unbearable. I grabbed it, my heart pounding, and saw a notification from an unknown number. Don't hide. We're already inside. I dropped the phone, backing away from the door, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The room felt too small, the walls closing in around me. I scanned the apartment, every shadow suddenly feeling like it was hiding something, someone, and then I heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper coming from the dark corner of my living room. It was soft, but unmistakable. We notice you. My skin crawled as I backed toward the door, my eyes fixed on the corner. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. Someone was there, watching, waiting. Without thinking, I bolted for the front door, yanking it open and stumbling into the hallway. I didn't stop to grab anything. I just ran. Down the stairs, out into the street, into the cold night air. I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to get away. But even as I ran, I knew it wasn't over. Because no matter how far I went, they would always notice me now. I didn't stop running until I was at least a mile away from my apartment, gasping for breath. The streetlights flickered overhead as I leaned against a building, trying to pull myself together. My heart was racing, my mind spiraling out of control. That whisper still echoed in my ears. We notice you. I couldn't go back. That much I knew. I had no idea who they were. But they had found me. They'd been inside my apartment. They knew where I lived. The sense of paranoia that had been creeping up on me was no longer paranoia. It was real. I had been sucked into something far darker than I ever could have imagined. The city felt colder than usual that night, the streets emptier. But there was something about the emptiness that felt deliberate, like the city itself was pushing people away, leaving me alone to face whatever was coming next. I didn't have a plan. My only thought was to keep moving, to stay in public places where I could blend in with the crowd. If I kept walking, kept to the noise and the lights, maybe I could stay one step ahead. But that creeping feeling of being watched never left me. Every person I passed on the street seemed to linger for a second too long, their eyes following me as I went by. Were they part of it? Or was it just my mind unraveling? I walked for what felt like hours, sticking to main roads, always glancing behind me to make sure no one was following. Eventually, I ended up in a crowded plaza. Even at night, it was bustling with people, tourists, street vendors, couples out for late-night drinks. The chatter of the crowd should have calmed me down, but instead, it only made me more anxious. I scanned the faces around me, searching for something familiar, something off. That's when I saw her. A woman, standing near the fountain in the center of the plaza. She looked out of place. Everyone around her was moving, but she stood perfectly still, her eyes locked on me. At first I thought it was a coincidence, just another random person in the crowd. But then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. She was wearing the same green jacket as the man I'd seen on the corner, the same one as Watcher 23's profile picture. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. She didn't move, didn't speak, just watched me with this blank, expressionless face. It was like she was waiting for me to do something, make a move. I broke eye contact and started walking faster, weaving through the crowd, hoping she wouldn't follow. But when I glanced back, she was still there, closer now, still watching. My stomach twisted into knots as I hurried through the plaza, pushing past people, my eyes darting around for an exit. I didn't know where I was going, just away from her, away from them. The crowd felt suffocating now, the noise too loud, the lights too bright. I could feel their presence everywhere, closing in on me. Another block, and I saw him. A man leaning against a lamppost, wearing the same jacket. His face was different, but that eerie blankness was the same. He didn't say anything, didn't try to stop me, but his eyes followed my every move. My pulse quickened, and I picked up the pace, trying to lose myself in the crowd again. But no matter where I went, there was always someone there, watching, waiting. By the time I reached the edge of the plaza, I felt like I was going to pass out from the sheer panic clawing at my chest. I ducked into an alleyway, hoping to catch my breath, to get away from their constant gaze. The street noise faded as I leaned against the cold brick wall, struggling to calm down, but the relief didn't last. Footsteps echoed from the mouth of the alley. I spun around, heart pounding, and there they were. Not one, but 3 people, standing at the entrance to the alley, all wearing the same green jacket, all staring at me with those same blank expressions, like they'd been waiting for me to corner myself. I backed up, but there was nowhere to go. The alley was a dead end. I was trapped. My phone buzzed in my pocket, but I didn't need to look at it to know what it said. I already knew. "We notice you." The words hung in the air, unspoken but suffocating. I could feel them getting closer, their presence pressing down on me, like they were waiting for me to break. I pulled out my phone, hoping for some kind of lifeline, some way out of this nightmare. But when I unlocked the screen, the dark web chat room was still open, and more messages had appeared since I had last looked. He's almost ready. We've been watching him for a long time. He'll join us soon. I dropped the phone, my hands shaking uncontrollably. Join them? What the hell did that mean? I had never felt more helpless in my life. The walls of the alley seemed to close in around me, the air thick with tension. The people at the mouth of the alley didn't move. They just stood there, staring, waiting. I tried to run, but my legs felt like lead. I stumbled backward, tripping over a trash can, my body collapsing against the cold pavement. I could feel my breath quickening, my chest tightening with fear. One of them took a step forward. I scrambled to my feet, desperate to escape, but the alley was too narrow, too tight. There was nowhere to go. The panic was overwhelming now, every nerve in my body screaming that this was the end. And then, just as suddenly as it began, they stopped. They stood there for a moment longer, watching me, their faces unreadable. Then, one by one, they turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd as if nothing had happened. I stayed there, crumpled on the ground, shaking with adrenaline. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened, but I couldn't. None of this made sense. Who were they? What did they want from me? I grabbed my phone, staring at the dark web chat room, the messages blurring in front of my eyes. It's only a matter of time now. He's starting to understand. My blood ran cold as the final message appeared. Welcome to the unseen. It was no longer a game. They had found me, and I knew, deep down, that this was far from over. I didn't go home that night. After what happened in the alley, home didn't feel like an option anymore. Nowhere felt safe. So I wandered, lost in the city, trying to keep myself grounded, trying to understand how I'd fallen into this nightmare. But the more I tried to make sense of it, the more it unraveled. The unseen, the support group, the people in the green jackets. None of it felt real, but it was. The next morning, I found myself in a 24-hour diner. It was one of those rundown places that never seemed to change, no matter how much time passed. I sat in a corner booth, nursing a coffee that had long gone cold, and tried to calm my nerves. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the low hum of conversation from the handful of patrons made it feel like I was invisible again, like I was back to being just another face in the crowd. But I knew better. I wasn't invisible anymore. I'd been noticed. My phone buzzed on the table, and I flinched. I didn't want to look, didn't want to see what they had sent me this time, but I couldn't help it. I picked it up and unlocked the screen. Another message from an unknown number. You can't run forever. We'll find you again. I put the phone down and stared out the window, trying to shake off the growing dread. I had no idea who these people were or what they wanted from me, but I knew they weren't going to stop. They were everywhere, watching, waiting. The waitress came by to refill my coffee, but when she looked at me, her face twisted in confusion. "Do I know you?" she asked, her eyes narrowing like she was trying to place me. "You look familiar, but I don't remember you being here before." My throat tightened. This was happening again. People who should recognize me acting like I was a stranger, like I didn't belong. "I've been here a few times," I said, forcing a smile. "Maybe you've seen me around." She nodded slowly, but the confusion didn't leave her face. She poured the coffee and walked away, glancing back at me once or twice like I was some kind of puzzle she couldn't solve. I felt sick. The walls were closing in again. That same suffocating feeling that had been creeping up on me since I joined that damn group. Everywhere I went, people were acting like I didn't belong. like I was slipping out of their memories. I grabbed my phone and opened the dark web chat room again. The messages were still there, waiting for me. He's starting to fade. They won't remember him soon. This is what happens when you become one of us. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. Fading? What the hell did they mean by that? I stared at the words, my mind racing, trying to piece it together. They weren't just talking about being ignored or overlooked. They were talking about something much worse. I was disappearing, slowly, piece by piece. And the worst part was, no one else seemed to notice. As I sat there, my phone buzzed again. Another message. This time it wasn't from the chat room. It was from Watcher 23. It's happening faster now. Soon, you'll be completely gone. My stomach dropped. I didn't understand what he meant, but the weight of those words hit me hard. Gone? How? I was still here. I was still me. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized it was true. People were forgetting me. My presence was slipping away. I needed to find answers. I couldn't just sit there and let this happen. I had to figure out who these people were, what the hell they'd done to me, and how I could stop it. I wasn't ready to just fade. I left the diner and made my way to a library. It was an old building, one of those places where the Wi-Fi barely worked and the computers were ancient, but it was quiet, and I needed space to think. I found a corner desk and logged into one of the computers, pulling up everything I could find about the unseen. It wasn't much, just vague references on deep web forums and threads that were long since dead. But one thing kept coming up. This group wasn't just a support group for people who felt invisible. It was something much darker. People who joined the group reported strange things happening to them. They felt like they were being watched. People in their lives started to forget them, like they were slowly being erased from existence. And then the reports would stop. The person would disappear. No more posts, no more messages. Gone. I stared at the screen, my pulse quickening. This wasn't just a coincidence. This was a pattern. Everyone who joined this group ended up disappearing. And now, it was happening to me. I scrolled through thread after thread, my panic rising with every post. These people weren't just fading from memory, they were being taken. And once they were taken, they were never seen again. I heard footsteps behind me, and my blood ran cold. Slowly, I turned around. A man stood there, staring at me. He wasn't wearing a green jacket, but there was something about him that set off alarm bells in my head. His eyes were locked on mine, intense, unblinking. "You need to leave," he said quietly. I stood up, my legs shaky, my mind racing. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely steady. He didn't answer. He just stared at me, like he was waiting for something. I grabbed my bag and backed away, my heart pounding. As I left the library, I glanced over my shoulder. He was still there, watching me, his eyes following me out the door. Once I was outside, I broke into a run. I didn't know where I was going, but I needed to get away. I needed to find somewhere safe. But as I ran, something became painfully clear. There was no safe place. Not anymore. I could feel it now. The fading. I was slipping out of the world, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The worst part wasn't that people were forgetting me. The worst part was that I was starting to forget myself. I didn't know how long I had been running, but it felt like I was moving through a dream. One where the streets stretched endlessly in every direction, and I wasn't sure if I'd ever reach the end. My mind was hazy, and the world around me felt warped. The streetlights flickered in and out. The shadows seemed to move, and nothing felt solid. That's when I realized it wasn't just the world that was changing. It was me. As I ran, I caught glimpses of my reflection in store windows, and each time I looked fainter. My outline was less distinct, like I was fading into the background. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to focus, tried to remember the details of my own face. My mind was fighting to hold on, but the harder I tried, the more everything slipped through my fingers. I stumbled into an alleyway, gasping for breath, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I leaned against the cold brick wall, feeling my body tremble as panic clawed at me from all sides. I pulled out my phone, desperate for something to ground me, to remind me that I was still here, still real. But when I looked at the screen, the dark web chat room was the only thing open, and the messages, they were waiting for me. It's almost over. You've been seen, now you'll disappear. Join us. Tears stung at my eyes as I scrolled through the messages, my hands shaking. There was no one to call, no one to help. I didn't know if anyone even remembered me anymore. I tried to think of someone, anyone, who would notice if I was gone, but every name, every face, was slipping further away from me. My friends, my family, even my own identity was slipping, like I was being erased from the inside out. My phone buzzed with one final message from Watcher 23. It's time. I dropped the phone, my chest tightening with fear. I looked around, the walls of the alley seeming to close in, the air thick and suffocating. I wasn't just fading in the reflection. I could feel it now, my body becoming less solid, less present, like I was dissolving into nothing. That's when I saw them. Figures, stepping out of the shadows. They were everywhere. From the mouth of the alley, from the corners I hadn't noticed before, people in green jackets. Their faces were blank, their eyes hollow. They moved silently, but their presence filled the space like a tidal wave, suffocating any hope I had left. There was no escape. They weren't chasing me. They were just waiting for me to realize that it was over. I backed up until I hit the far wall of the alley, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The fear was unbearable, but something deeper gnawed at me, an overwhelming sense of loss, of being forgotten. We see you, one of them said, stepping closer. His voice was soft, almost kind, but it chilled me to my core. We've always seen you, another one added. I shook my head, my vision blurring with tears. What do you want from me? I choked out, my voice trembling. The figure in front of me, the one I now knew was Watcher 23, tilted his head, almost like he was confused by the question. We don't want anything, he said calmly. We just want you to understand. Understand what? My voice cracked. I was barely holding on, my mind unraveling faster than I could keep up with. He took another step forward, his blank eyes locking onto mine. You're one of us now. You always were. The moment you joined, you became part of the unseen. People will forget you. You'll forget yourself. But that's the point. The words sank into me like a stone. I was shaking my head, denying it, trying to push the reality away. I didn't ask for this, I whispered. I didn't want this. He smiled, and the sight made my skin crawl. No one does. But once you're noticed by us, once you're part of this, there's no going back. You'll disappear, just like the rest of us. You'll become unseen. I fell to my knees, feeling the cold ground beneath me, but even that sensation was fading. I was fading. My hands looked translucent now, like they didn't belong to me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My voice was gone. The figures surrounded me, their eyes unblinking, their presence all-consuming. They didn't need to touch me. They didn't need to do anything. I was slipping away on my own. And then something terrifying happened. I couldn't remember my name. It hit me like a freight train. I tried to grasp it, to hold on to the one thing that made me me, but it was gone. The panic, the terror, everything that I had been fighting, none of it mattered anymore. I was disappearing, not just from the world, but from myself. My vision blurred, my body felt weightless, and then nothing. I don't know how long I drifted in that emptiness. Time didn't matter anymore. Space didn't matter. It was like I was floating in some void, a shadow of who I used to be, without any sense of myself or the world around me. And slowly, the emptiness gave way to something else, a presence. I wasn't alone. I never had been. I felt others, the unseen. I was part of them now. And as that realization sank in, the fear faded. The panic disappeared. I was no longer fighting it. I had become unseen.